I suppose I've got quite a number of slides here, but I'm going to fly through them because what I want to talk about more is the experience of how we moved our civic approach in Derry, Londonderry, Stroke City, Maiden City, or Legendary, whatever we want to call it these days. It's important to note that I come from an organisation called Derry Healthy Cities. We're an NGO. We don't belong to any one body in the Derry City Council area. But we were the driving force in setting up this civic approach to alcohol harm reduction. And I know from the briefing in relation to today that alcohol is one of your themes. And I suppose what I'm going to try and show you is not so much what we've done, because that's always nice and glossy, and it's good for the media to say we've done all this great stuff. I'll try and tell you a wee bit more about the warts and all of how we did it, and more specifically the challenges. It's not the easiest topic to grapple with. So I'm going to talk about where we were in 2005 when we started this. Oh, gone on too far. The kind of the context at that time, the approaches we used, and I suppose some of the initiatives, and I'll do those very quickly. There's a couple of case studies, and I suppose at where we are now as well. I suppose one of the things is that when we were asked to do this, there was a suggestion that maybe because our piece of work was council-wide, or it might be very big, but to put some context in this, our urban area of our council is only 100,000 people. So we're quite a small area. In fact, as a city, it's quite a small city. By your standards, we're probably just a very large neighbourhood in some ways. But it's to show how we can kind of manage alcohol in a broader perspective. Back in that time, 2005, there was quite a number of things coming together at the one time. Sky TV had a programme called City Beat, which was airing on television and showing police officers in Derry on an average night out. And it was also at a time when we were coming out of conflict, and we still had a city centre that was very much built to avoid being bombed. So at night it was quite dark, it was quite depressing. There was a lot of kind of grills over windows and shutters and so on. So on the City Beat programme, I was watching it one night, didn't even know what it was, and I couldn't recognise this city until the camera panned back and suddenly realised it was our city, and there were people pointing 7 ounces or whatever out of each other, all drunk. And our whole focus of the programme was around drunkenness. We also had a kind of a growing media perception of Derry as just being very violent. Now, all the statistics in relation to alcohol violence in Northern Ireland were actually said completely the opposite. We were the second safest city in Northern Ireland. But statistically, our media, and we've too many media for a population of 100,000, we're just constantly running stories about someone's going to get killed, this is disgraceful, and so on. The other thing to put in context is, coming out of conflict, Derry sits on the border with Donegal, so we have a large cross-border trade, large cross-border economy dependent on tourism. We need an image for a city that people want to come and visit. And I suppose the fourth thing that was happening at that time that was really kind of pressing on us is that as a city we were out in the world trying to say, come and invest in Derry. It's the place to come. We have a great workforce. We have a capacity for you to work with us. And at the same time, the elected officials, and our mayor rotates annually, the elected officials were going to America to say, come and visit Derry, come and invest in Derry. And then on the next page of their paper, they were out saying, someone's going to get killed in Derry if this fighting over alcohol doesn't stop. So there was always that mixed message that was really kind of making the place attractive and then unattractive. We also had, I suppose, a new and developing community police and safety process in Derry, which was showing that a very high population percentage believed alcohol was our biggest problem. And it was one of the biggest problems in antisocial behaviour in our city. We have a main general hospital that services 300,000 people in the northwest of Ireland, and about 2 out of every 3 admissions to their A&E were alcohol related, and they were spent in over 20 million a year just managing alcohol related conditions. So the picture was quite bleak, and we'd done our own research and showed that Derry was starting to find that children as young as 12 were getting drunk for the first time, and all the evidence shows that every 10 years that number goes down by 2 years. So we kind of thought, right, it's time to draw a line in the sand. And as it happened, there was an awful lot of conversation going on at the time about alcohol anyway. And I was doing lots of presentations like this, and there were public debates and so on. But what it was just talk. Everybody was talking. And what we do in a lot of these situations when we have a problem is when we say, what do we actually do? Everyone shrugged their shoulders and went, but sure, that's the way we are. We've been like this for generations. We just have to live with it. And we eventually got to the stage and said, well, actually, no, maybe we don't. The other factor that drives it is our own attitude to alcohol. We as a nation celebrate the fact that we like to drink. And we actually are known around the world for our fondness for alcohol. And if you walk into the local, if you go into the tourist office in Derry even today, where some of these pictures have come from, you will find that half of the product that they sell, and anybody that goes through Belfast Airport will see the same, more than half of the product they sell is alcohol related. It's all about Guinness, it's about Diageo, it's about all the things that we kind of recognise in ourselves as being kind of a community that likes to drink. And that's fine. We recognise that majority of people in our society can drink and drink responsibly. However, there are still those who just don't know where that tipping point is. And actually, in fact, what we realised from our work is that none of us knew where the tipping point was, because no one in our lives had ever spoken to us about alcohol. It was one of those things that just came into your life at a certain time, and you just never had any kind of education on it. No one told you the difference, what dangers there were, why it's called, why there are safe limits, why it's called an intoxicant, all these sorts of issues. Just socially, we never dealt with. I grew up in a very, very large family. My mother's from 18 children. I have about 60, 70 cousins and 100 and something second cousins and great-grandchildren and so on. We had massive parties. We came together in a house, and at 10 and 9 and 8 years of age, I was the barman. So I ran and got the drink and I brought it back, and that was my job at the parties where the crack was good. And it was just because it was harmless. It was just part of our culture. And what we really realised was that this cultural bit is maybe the problem for us. We have a long-term love affair with alcohol that is culturally ingrained. We achieved it over generations. We weren't going to nip this in the bud overnight. The other thing we had to recognise is that alcohol is not all bad for us in terms of our economy, and it'll be much bigger for yourselves, but it brings about $1 billion a year into our economy. It provides jobs. It's an essential part of our lives. And for many people who can manage alcohol responsibly, it's important that we keep that balance, and we recognise that it's not all bad. And that was important for us as well, because when we started this process, what we were looking at was that the changing trend in how we were drinking our alcohol. The majority of people had stopped going to the pubs. More and more people were buying it off sales. Supermarkets had got licences. They'd been slammed in Ireland for offering milk too cheap because it was hurting the farmers. So they put up the price of milk and they dropped the price of alcohol just to get us in the door. And the way in which we drank then changed dramatically as well. We started, because it was cheaper, because it was more available. Tesco would have argued, nobody in from Tesco, Tesco would have argued that 60 cans of beer would not be drunk in one night. And we were kind of saying, well, yes, it will. If it's there, it will, because you keep going till you fall down. That's the culture we have. And interestingly, we have the lowest expenditure in alcohol in the UK, possibly because some of it's bought in the Republic and shipped back north. But we also have the highest drinks consumed outside the house. We spend the highest on drinks consumed outside the house. So there's still a kind of a changing trend demographic for us. But that was important too, because what's the point in talking to 100,000 people about how they drink alcohol if you don't recognise where they're actually at? And that's one of the biggest challenges. In fact, one of the biggest criticisms we've had in the early days of this work is people in suits turning up and preaching at people about alcohol is bad for you. And then they'd see us in the supermarket that night buying 3 cases of beer for 20 quid. It's that kind of dichotomy that we were really challenged with. And we were told that our language was very middle class, and it was. We had mostly academics around the table. We were talking to communities for whom drink was just a natural part of their shopping list. In fact, they maybe spent more on drink sometimes than they spent on other things. So what was the point in us kind of middle-class liberals there saying, alcohol is really bad for you? We needed to find a way in a communication and a level to talk to people that made them take ownership of this issue. And that was probably one of the biggest learnings for us in the early days. Far from it, we were reared, as they would say in our part of the world. We kind of just knew that we were tackling it wrong. Big issue on leadership. As I said to you, we had this dichotomy of leadership saying in the papers, come to Derry, and then on the next page saying, somebody's going to get killed. And we had a very kind of change in political environment at that stage, and no disrespect to the politicians in the room. They liked to get in the media. And the media just went to their doorsteps every day. So there was 3 kids arrested last night. Do you want to say something? There was a guy kicked about last night. Do you want to say something? And they said very negative stuff. And it was very vitriolic stuff about their own city. It came to a head whenever in 2004 we had a young lady from Derry whose husband was from America, and he abducted her children and took them back to America. Our mayor, who's now an MLA, went to America as part of a delegation to encourage the court to let this child come home. And her husband's defence team asked him why Derry was the place to come, and it was the land of saints and scholars, and Seamus Heaney was from there, and it's a brilliant city, it's a development city. And they started showing him the headlines out of the Derry Journal and the Derry Sentinel newspaper saying, you said this, Mr. Mayor. Do you really think this is the place to send a child to grow up? That's when the penny started to drop about, this wasn't even about culture, this was about image. We had a cultural image problem. We wanted to make Derry an investment town, an attractive town, but what we weren't doing was we weren't making the place look attractive. We were actually doing completely the opposite. So we had this kind of subscribe to fatalism approach about everything was bad. We were ignoring the tensions going on in the community around drug and alcohol. And the other thing I'd say is coming out of conflict, these issues probably hadn't been seen majorly in the Troubles. They were there, but we had other things to worry about in the Troubles, and drinking and drugs were way down the scale, you know. So suddenly we were starting to realise this was a hidden issue we hadn't dealt with before. We were doing the easy things. We were throwing up posters. We were doing one-off talks. We weren't actually grabbing the problem. We weren't actually getting in and saying, look, we took 50, 100 years to get here. We need a long-term solution to get us out of here. And we just thought it's a health issue. We'll let the health sector deal with it. When in truth, and as you'll know from this room as well, it was everybody's issue. It was getting everybody to talk about it. And we had about 3 or 4 or 5 attempts to start some sort of conversation about this. And we started them from the NGO perspective of trying to invite people into the room. Our local government's very different from yours. We don't have policing and education and housing and everything under the one roof to some degree. We have a local government that looks after essentially, very cynically, bogs, bins and burials is what they're looking after. And the housing's a separate organisation, policing and so are separate. And as an NGO, we had no mandate to pull them into the room. So what we eventually did was we found a mayor who was prepared to run with it, and we put it in as a civic-led approach to alcohol harm reduction. And the first thing I'd say to you is, if you're going to do it, lock the doors once you get them in the room, because the conversation has to be brutally honest. It has to be very, very focused on the real issues as they're experienced by people. There's no point sitting in a room saying, it's all the vintner's fault, unless you have the vintners in the room saying, well, actually, here's what we're saying, and it's about the stuff that's coming in, people drunk before they get across our doorstep. And what we had were 3 or 4 very, very, what we call bloodletting meetings. They were vicious. They were really vicious. And people fought almost semi-aggressively across the room. It was a good job the police were there, but they were fighting too. And everybody was kind of getting stuck in saying, it's your fault, and if you did this and if you did that, it'd be so much better. And nobody was prepared to step back and say, well, hold on, where we need to look first is what we do ourselves as individuals, not even in our professional roles. It's what we do as individuals ourselves. I can't stand in a room and say to you, you shouldn't be doing this and you shouldn't be doing that, when then I'm out in my social context creating a peer role model perception that alcohol's grand and we should drink as much as we like and sure it's all great and will not do any harm and it's harmless. So there was a big challenge in that. We had a number of agencies who literally threw the rattle out of the pram, just said, not playing, don't want to know. We had our youth sector, which belongs to Education Library Board, stood up at one meeting and said, it's very clear this is about drinking on the street at night. It therefore has nothing to do with us. Well, that was the most fatalistic statement I've ever heard in my life, because about 40 agencies kicked the crap out of them for 20 minutes about, you are dealing with young people. How can you say this is not your issue? And it was just, again, because of people's direction and where they were coming from, they had no context of what they were trying to do. This thing doesn't like me, it keeps changing too fast. So we decided we had 3 key things we would do. Is raise awareness of the need to create change. It wasn't even about the change, it was the need to create change. It was to get people involved. And if somebody said, what did the first few years look like? It was talking and talking and talking. Not even talking at, but talking with. It was conversational. We very rarely created a room this size. We went to small, defined community groups, and we said, what do you think about alcohol? What are the issues? And we let them express their views first. And the main, most people had similar views. Sure, it's grand, it's part of our life, it's who we are. Sure, we're Irish, we couldn't go abroad if we couldn't have a drink. And when you started then introducing, I suppose, the subtle education about, did you know that the alcohol content has got stronger over a number of years? Did you know that the price has dropped significantly over year and that it is now probably more affordable than it's ever been? Did you know that the industry has this thing called entry-level drinkers that they're targeting with these alco pops, and there's a lot of vagueness about who entry-level are? And did you know that the vintner isn't the industry? Because we didn't have any tied pubs in Derry. All our vintners were standalone businesses in their own right, but they were just retailers. The industry was Diageo and all these world powers who drove the trend. And the reality was we couldn't change that from our context. We couldn't make Diageo change their global policy. They just want to sell Guinness, and that's what they do. So we had to look at, well, what are the things we can do locally, and what are the role of our vintners as retailers in that process, because they're only another element of the food order. So we wanted to initiate that process of cultural change, and we said very clearly from the outset, this is a long game. This will not happen quickly. So we set a few objectives. The big thing was still children. In fact, when we set this up, we called it an alcohol and violence forum, not realising it was the most negative name we could ever give this thing. And we also had a lot of focus on children. It's always about the kids. If the kids would stop drinking, we were fine. Went and talked to some young people, and they said, well, if you would stop drinking, it might change our behaviour. And that's when the penny again started to drop. We blamed kids because they didn't have a vote, they didn't have a voice. It was very easy to say, it's their problem. And the big thing we always did was, who owns these children? Every time I went on the radio, they kept starting with the negatives about all these kids drinking in the street and whatever, and I kept saying, but look, we don't have 40,000 orphans in Derry. These kids belong to someone, and how do we get that communication and how do we engage with those parents? We wanted that alternative focus so we could have events without alcohol, because our whole lives are alcohol related. Christening to death, the booze comes out, and we were saying, is that the best way? And we wanted to look at what were the best practice standards from other areas. And we had a wide range of anticipated outcomes, and probably too many in the first instance, because we had this brilliant notion we were going to change all this stuff very quickly. But what we did know was we needed what we called the stakeholder jigsaw. This didn't work without all these pieces coming together. Each agency, each sector had its own role to play. A lot of them had to be educated on their role, and that's a very critical part of the process. You need to let people see why it's important for them to do this. The education people and youth were the classic example. This doesn't impact on us directly, but you have the audience that it impacts on, so what's your role? And we ultimately got to this kind of loose structure, an open civic alcohol forum, because there's no membership, it's free for all. Anybody can come, anybody with an interest. It's managed by ourselves in Derry Healthy Cities. It connects through the Police and Community Safety Partnership, which is owned by Council, into Council. It has a small steering group where the work gets done on a day-to-day basis. We have an annual Chief Officers meeting where we bring in the big honchos and we say, look, this is what we're doing, this is what we need to do. And we did lots of initiatives just to keep the conversation going. And the biggest thing in the road was Chatham House rules. What's said in the room stays in the room. It was the only way we could get people to move, because obviously if you're there with an agency hat and you say, I think our service needs more support in, your chief executive would have rattled you the next day. You needed to have the freedom to speak from whatever agency you're at. So we wanted this commitment to leadership, the shared responsibility, and most importantly, we went for quick wins. We knew it was a long-term game, but we went for quick wins. And we developed a first action plan around the 4 stages of going out at night. The getting ready, because people get drunk at home, how you manage people when they were out and how you dispersed them when they were leaving, how you manage the venues so that the bouncers weren't beating the heads of people in terms of we are removing you from the premises, and how people understood you couldn't take glass out and all those sorts of issues. And we then looked at the environment as well. Where do kids go to drink? Why is it attractive to drink there? What are all the kind of the physical things we can change? And then we started with the initiatives, and we just rattled these things out. And the main purpose of initiatives, more than anything else, was purely to keep public profile there. We started with a charter commitment from the council, which was every agency was asked to sign up. We did ID schemes where if you had only 1 of 5 IDs, you wouldn't get into a premises without them. So all these internet IDs wouldn't work. We had a major off-licence code of practice, which was a voluntary scheme of 24 off-licences in the city, 22 signed up straight away about how they managed the release of alcohol. We did little gimmicky things like stick to your limits fridge magnets with a made-to-measure spirit measure, just again blitzing these out into the community. Believe it or not, we had a major piece of work in just getting the town centre decided as an alcohol-free zone. It was, but it wasn't signed. We did that. We engaged schools. This was a primary school. The kids did a series of posters. These are mummies and daddies. And the kids were very involved in the conversation. We had some very good teachers. And we get kids to say what they saw in terms of alcohol. We brought stuff in from around the world. We went to, some people came back from Sweden, said they'd seen this great scheme in Sweden that every second round had to be water. It was a mandatory in restaurants. We piloted that. We had a night bus scheme for the first time ever, getting people in and out. We got the vintners on board. We did a responsible promotions protocol with them, which again was voluntary, and the vintners policed it themselves. You could only promote 2 drinks at any one time. You couldn't drop below certain prices. So a poster would look up on a Friday morning, and the vintners would go out on a Friday afternoon and tear it down. It was very much a community-owned process. We created little initiatives like Respect the Shamrock around Paddy's Day. All our pubs signed up, all the staff wore T-shirts. We had big campaigns like Festival Care, where we kind of gave standards on how to manage community events and manage alcohol. So we just kept blitzing it out there. Lots and lots of little projects to keep the thing going. I'll give you 2 quick case studies, conscious of time. Halloween is one of our biggest events now in our calendar every year. 25 years ago, we were one of the few areas that offered a Halloween carnival. We had about 25,000 people coming. And because people wore masks and dressed up, it was very hard to say who was 12, who was 25, who was whatever. About 8,000 to 25,000 people came, depending on the year. About 1,000 of them got blitzed and kicked the crap out of each other. And the media focused on the 1,000. And we kept saying we need to manage something in this Halloween thing. So we started the process using that kind of carnival care approach of saying, how do we change the way in which we manage our carnival process? So we had the 2 tiers working. We had the community multidisciplinary teams and then the agencies, and we put them in the one room and said, we need to make this safer. We carried out school visits before carnival time. We would talk to the kids, we would talk to parents. We created massive meal drops into anybody and everybody that might be coming to Halloween festivals. We created parent centres on Halloween night, which was like a creche for mums and dads, where they could drop their kids off, go somewhere, come and pick them up. We kept bombarding the media. We got people on the front line to be media case studies. We really pushed and pushed and pushed the boundaries. We made the entire city centre drink-free. The police very bravely just removed all alcohol from anybody that came through the door. The police party, by the way, at Christmas is fantastic, but because they've all this free booze from Halloween. The basis is they take the booze, and if people can prove they're 18 the following morning, they can have it back. Nobody ever came looking for it back. We had cells, literally, full to the guts with booze. And we changed the whole aspect of the city centre, made it family friendly. We created carnival care wardens whose job was really to go around and say, look, if he's lying flat out on the ground, there's something wrong with him and somebody needs to get him home, and not just ignore him, which had been happening. People stepped over them. We had lots of community-based campaigns, and we kind of just encouraged everybody to be part of making Halloween safe. And what we saw was that we carried out media evaluation. So 2006 media evaluation was showing we had a positive media value of 54,000. I have no idea how they measure this, and 16,000 negative. And you'll see that year on year it's been building up. We had about 50,000 visitors in Derry this year for Halloween. Halloween's so big in Derry that in the Portuguese version of Family Fortunes, it's a ticket prize to come to Derry for Halloween. And our policing and A&E statistics have now actually dropped over Halloween. They're no different from an ordinary weekend. In fact, sometimes they're lower. And we're now getting the safest on record. I put this project up as well. This was a small neighbourhood project of about 10,000 people. Big issues in the press about older people feeling terrified in their houses, about OAPs coming out and finding their gardens full of detritus of condoms and everything else that goes with this kind of socially drunk behaviour, and pensioners living in fear. So we decided, right, well, we might be able to do something on a targeted basis with this. So again, we went in and asked the community, what can we do here? The critical thing again was it was mainly older people involved in the conversation. All the other generations were missing. And we started the process of how do we engage with these people, put them in the one room and get the agencies involved. We had high visibility patrolling started much more often by the police to create that sense of safety. And what we actually did was we started trying and do a lot of intergenerational work. It was all about the young kids were doing this and the older people were scared. And when we started putting them together, they started to build a relationship. We did a reward in return. We were taking kids away on away days, and in return, they had to do some sort of social responsibility activities back in their community. So they were doing gardening schemes, they were helping the older people clean up the estate, they were doing luggage or litter drops and litter pickups. They started a secret Santa type thing where the kids went round at Christmas dropping food packages through doors, and we created a social responsibility in the neighbourhood. The outcomes, much better than we ever thought. We got the retailers involved. They actually set up their own forum. We had local retailers working on their off sales. We did responsible server training. We did a whole range of things in that community to change the understanding. But the most important thing again was we kept a conversation going. We just kept it as a conversation. What do you think? Did you see this? Did you see that? What do you think of Heineken getting the rugby match played on Easter Sunday, which is a no-no in Ireland for drinking? You know, so there was all this sort of stuff that we just used as general conversation. And we saw differences in our crime stats. This was the referral to youth diversion. They started to drop and consistently continue to drop because the kids were now part of their community. They were no longer an isolated function. And again, the media profile went from very negative to very positive to then we had a Baroness Newlive come over, and we then ended up getting the MJ Municipal Government Achievement Award in 2012. So where we are today has actually moved on significantly. A few years ago, the Office of the First and Deputy First Minister agreed that Derry needed some special focus, so we decided we would develop a one plan for Derry. One city, one plan, one voice. We had 80 strategies, none of them effective, so this was to be the one. And somebody asked me, how did you do the consultation? We consulted to death. Is that a word? We consulted to death. We did anything and everything to make sure that not a single citizen in our city could say, I wasn't consulted about this plan. We used the internet, we used face-to-face, we did whatever we could, competitions, we major meal drops, all of that stuff. And we ended up with a multi-agency plan that had 5 key pillars and 11 catalyst themes. And Derry Healthy Cities looks after the health and well-being and early intervention themes. The interesting thing was, this was about 6 years after we started. People had embraced the notion of changing the culture of alcohol. It became a key priority in the plan. It had some challenges. We didn't want to be anti-alcohol, because we certainly aren't. We can't still condone a message of anti-alcohol, because it doesn't work. It has to be about community development, and it has to be tied to the programme for government as well, because there's no point in us doing it in isolation. So what we've been doing is developing the notion of Derry as a key leader in community mobilisation. This is a fancy term that Professor Harold Holder in America has given to getting people to work together. It's about making the reality that alcohol is everybody's responsibility, educating those partners in what they need to do, but giving the community the control of the design. It has to be bottom up. It has to be led by what the community says is an issue, not by what the statisticians and the public say is an issue. We do it because, most of all, it builds social capital. It allows the community to feel ownership in a process that they currently feel disempowered in. It's a long-term education. We still have primary schools that offer alcohol as a prize at the school raffle, because the local pub gives it to them. Now, we've been doing that for years. Nobody thinks it's ironic that an 8-year-old wins and gets handed a bottle of whiskey. It's just a cultural thing, and it's those wee things that we're starting to change. We now have a culture of alcohol plan, which is focused on leadership, community development, partnership cooperation, information sharing and monitoring, and it's in line with the national strategies. And it recognises all the good work that's going on. It recognises that we don't have all the answers. And at the start we said, take brave steps. You will make mistakes, but it's the only way you learn. And it's being brave about making the mistakes. 8-9 years ago, I hadn't a clue what I was talking about in alcohol. We just worked our way through it, and we got there. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but these are the kind of key elements of the plan. Do you understand the tiers in health? The tiers 1 to 4? Tiers 3 and 4 are people who are at the stage in alcohol consumption where they're in a medical facility or seeing someone medical. We don't have an awful lot of influence in that, but what we want to do is stop the flow towards there. So our work is focused on the tiers 1 and 2, the general community stuff that changes the way in which people drink to stop them getting into long-term conditions and long-term problems. Messaging's a big issue. We're still getting hit with the middle class issue. We're looking at who are the role models in our society, the sports stars, whoever that can actually speak and say, it's okay not to drink. Hidden harm's a big part of it. We need to continue to engage with our vintners, particularly in recession. One of the biggest changes we've had in recession is that Diageo is now the biggest bank in Northern Ireland. They lend money to pubs. So what were previously not tied houses are now tied houses. That's a big issue for us, and we need to work with them. The other thing is we don't train bar staff in Northern Ireland. They just walk in and said, can you pull a pint? Grand, you're working. Again, we've done a lot of work around that as well. Changing from every angle the way in which you manage alcohol. Building capacity. And the bit we're trying to work on now is how we do the monitoring evaluation. I suppose what I'd say to you going forward is what is it you want to achieve? These are the big questions that really we still work with on a daily basis. What do people actually understand about the problem? And who do they believe it belongs to? And most importantly, do they think they have a role in it? Because most of us are role models in one way or another. How does vision fit with current practice? It's the preaching versus practice piece again. Health promotion, historically in Derry, just preached at people. Gave them leaflets. Here, read that. Stop doing stuff. We broadened the breadth of responsibility. Everybody from the clergy in the pulpit, to the police officers on the street, to the community leaders, to the school teachers, everybody's getting on message so that we're getting consistent messaging. And the key thing about mobilisation is if you try to change the individual and you have a great talk with them and they say, I'm going to change my behaviour, and they go out into their local youth club the next day and everybody's pushing them a bottle of beer, or they go out that night to the off licence and they find they get a free bottle of wine with their Chinese, all those sorts of things just impact on the work you're doing with the individual. So what we do in mobilisation is we change the environment so that the individual go into 6 or 7 settings in the community, hears and sees the same thing. It becomes attractive. We now have parents who are saying, this christening will be alcohol free. It never used to happen. It's just the way people have changed. And it's not just for match days. It's not a one-off. It's about being relevant 24/7, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. There's no point saying we need services for young people that only open to 5 o'clock. You know, it's that sort of stuff that's culturally changing. And how do you get schools opened after 5 when they're sitting with all these big empty spaces, kids are standing outside with nothing to do? How do you bring that together? That's the big bit. And the other thing I'd say for you is never ignore the big fucking elephant in the room. It's always going to be there, and that's why the honesty is really critical. If you want to make change in alcohol harm, it's not about management, it's about leadership. Thank you.